Well, this is a great pleasure for me to share these things with you, because I've been working, I think it was back in the late 60s that I first encountered this notion, and as Steinmetz said, when I looked at it, it looked like it was contrary to everything I'd learned, and I was going to have to turn everything upside down to comprehend it. And when I looked in the history books to see if it corresponded, I didn't find a lot of resonance there either. And then over time I realized that two things. That one, my understanding of the Yugas was very shallow, and what I expected to find wasn't necessarily what was really there. And two, our history books are more interpretation than fact. They're all interpreted from interpreting facts from the standpoint of a linear progression, and this is a whole different spin. So it took time for me to realize that I wanted to study the history in order to understand how the Yugas worked, kind of turning it around that way. And then things began to fall into place. So by the 80s, I was teaching, and by the 90s, I was trying to write a book, and I got a little bogged down, and by the 2000s, we got the book out. So it's been a long journey. But it's all about change. And I know there's all kinds of outer changes happening around us, but there's a method to it, there's a system to it, there's an underlying change that tells us, gives meaning to all the other changes. And it has to do with consciousness. That's, when you pick it up by that thread, then a lot of things begin to fall into place. And indeed, we are moving into a new age. We hear the term a lot, and nobody's quite sure exactly what that means. Well, it turns out our concept of age is an old one. It goes back to the 8th century BC in the Western culture, to the Greek civilization, and they talked about the ages. Hesiod was a Greek poet that is the oldest record we have of it. And so we'll start there. We'll kind of review what, we've all heard about the Greek ages. He talked about not a golden age, but curiously, an age of golden men. Now it's interesting they use the metals this way, because gold doesn't tarnish. Gold is always brilliant. And so the people of that time had a very high consciousness. This was the time of a paradise, as they describe it, where food was available in nature, and you didn't need shelter. Everything was harmonious. There was no disease. Cultures around the globe agree on the characteristics of these ages. Well, they began to be a little bit less than perfect, and Zeus destroyed that race and created another race of men he called the silver men. Well, silver tarnishes quite readily. Well, it just takes a little polishing to bring the shine back. And so that's a very good analogy. These people were a little lower in consciousness. They had to become farmers. They had to gather together in cities. They had somehow didn't have access to the freely available stuff in nature. The animals weren't friendly with them anymore, and they needed to domesticate them. So this was the age of silver men. And they began to commit crimes and do evil things, and so Zeus destroyed them too and created another race of bronze men. Now he wasn't doing very well, because each race seems to be worse than the former. The bronze people, now bronze, you think of bronze as generally pretty black. You could really, really polish it and get it shiny. Maybe in the form of brass or copper, it can get pretty shiny, but it takes a lot of work to keep it that way. So this is a nice analogy for the consciousness of people who were building empires and were dictatorial rulers. There were lots of wars, and it was not an easy time. These people, in fact, destroyed themselves, according to their lectures. Now this begins to sound a little bit like modern times, doesn't it? All right, they were gone, so Zeus tried again. He created the race of Iron Men. But Iron Men were just constantly in toil. There was just trouble everywhere, lots and lots of work. Everything was very difficult. And Hesiod regretted that he lived in that age, but acknowledged that you could make spiritual progress in any age, and that's a key point to what we're going to be talking about today. So here's an idea of the ages in the Western culture. Now there's an idea of ages in the Eastern too, and our basis for the understanding of it that we're sharing today comes from Sri Yukteswar, Guru of Paramahansa Yogananda. In 1894, he wrote a little book and didn't publish it really. In 1901, he started putting it out in installments in his little newsletter. In fact, he proclaimed to the world at that point that a new age had begun, and made a whole marched around and people threw stones at him. It was that popular an idea. So, if you read carefully down here, it says for members and donors only. It was 1920 the printer that printed the little newsletter, put it together in a book. So 1920 is when the book came out, The Holy Science, and we have modern versions that have been released and printed in this country, a little bit edited. But not, it seems like it was for the world, but he didn't really put it out there very far. The book itself, The Holy Science, if you look at it, it is full of the most profound spiritual teachings. The Yugas are described in the introduction. Now at first I thought, well, he was going to publish this book on spiritual teachings, and he sort of tacked on this pet idea that he had. But as I began to realize, what you write in an introduction is what the reader needs to know in order to appreciate the rest of the book, right? So this must be important. In order to appreciate what's happening today, in order to appreciate why the spiritual teachings are coming in the form they are these days, why other teachers are coming, maybe this is key. It was the introduction to a very profound and deep spiritual book. Not a very big one either, it's only a few inches high. Okay, so what's the Vedic notion of the ages? Well, the ancient teachings are that there were 4 ages, sure enough, and called the Satya Yuga corresponds to the Golden Age. The Treta Yuga corresponds to the Silver, and Gopara corresponds to the Bronze Age, and Kali Age is the darkest age that corresponds to the Greek Iron Age. So these ideas are much older than the Greek ideas, and have been around for a long time and has a lot of tradition around it. Now, all the traditions say that at the end of the Kali, well, before I get into that, one of the things that the Hindu tradition does of these ages is give specific time periods and even dates. And that's nothing, no other tradition in other ages, other cultures are that specific. And so the scriptures say that the yugas are 1,200 years in multiples. 1, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and that's Dwa, 2, Tre, 3. Satya Yuga is sometimes called Krita Yuga, 4. So these 1, 2, 3, 4 times 1,200 years. That makes a total of 12,000 years. And there's the agreement everywhere that after the Dark Age ends, there's a return to the highest age again. Trouble is, in almost every case, nobody said how long that would take. And in fact, people took the idea that at the end of the Kali Yuga was when the Golden Age would come. And so you usually see this picture drawn as a closed circle where this point reaches that point. But Yukteswar says that isn't how things work in nature. nature takes just as long to get from midnight to noon as it did to get from noon to midnight. Everything in nature works in that kind of symmetrical way. So, he said, well, it must be that we return the way we came. Okay? That this Kali Yuga is followed by another Kali Yuga of ascending consciousness. And one by one, we return to the highest stage, and the real cycle is 24,000 years. Now, he's not unique in this. There is an ancient Buddhist tradition that has this arranged in the same way. And so he claims, Yukteswar claims, that this was the original idea. They got lost. They got lost during the Dark Ages, during the Kali Yuga. And so other changes happened during that time. They multiplied the time periods by 360 times. So if you go to India today, or you read about these things in many sources, they will tell you we're in the Kali Yuga now, and we will be for some 400 and some thousand years to go. That's a very discouraging thought. Yukteswar says, no, we're going back to the original idea of 12,000 year intervals, and that gives us, puts us in a lot better place. We'll see in a moment. He also connected with the precession of the equinoxes. Now, this is an astronomical phenomenon that astrologers and astronomers are familiar with, where we say the equinox precesses through the various signs or constellations of the sky. You've heard that we're in the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius is coming. And this takes about 25,800 years or so to happen. The equinox is the direction in space of the sun on the first day of spring. So whatever the star field is behind that, that constellation then is where the vernal equinox is. So we think of the vernal equinox as that point, and that gradually works its way around the whole sky in this long, long period, sometimes called the Great Year. That's where I tied these two cycles together. Well, the astronomers say that this cycle takes 25,800 years. Yukteswar says this is 24,000 years. I don't see a problem with that. We're entering into an age of not either or, but both and. Astronomers use more precise numbers. The rest of us use simple numbers. The ancients used 360 days for the length of the year, and then had a 5-day holiday just to catch up. It was okay, it didn't bother them. But imagine what your geometry class would be like if you had to work with a 365.25 degree circle. It'd be very difficult. So they simplified things at 360 degrees. And I think that Yukteswar simplified this, the ancients really, to 24,000 years in order that we can understand it and talk about it. Because the time doesn't matter that much. Particularly since this teaching came from an earlier time when there was a lot more, time wasn't anywhere near the limitation that we think it is today. And we'll talk more about that. Well, we could talk about the astrology and the astronomy of this for the next week. But I don't want to get started on that today because I want to express this with a little different direction of thinking. I want you to think of the earth as a classroom. Now, the underlying assumptions here are that we are souls who are incarnated for the purpose of learning and evolving and maturing, and that we incarnate repeatedly in just the circumstances we need to get the lessons that we need to get and fulfill our desires. Given that, think of the earth then as a classroom that has classes for freshmen during this period of time, for sophomores, for juniors, and a time for seniors, and some people graduate and others keep going. So that each period of time is appropriate for people of a particular level of spiritual development. Now this mirrors the development of an individual. A yogi will go through the various states of consciousness that are characteristic of these ages, and he can do that in any age. We're talking here about the sort of average, everyday, average consciousness of the people on the planet at any one time. And as we see, as we look at the history of it, we'll look at the traditions that give us an idea of what that consciousness is and its characteristics, and we'll see in history that how that's supported in each of these ages appropriately. So here we are. We've incarnated in this time and this place because we have desires and we have needs that can be fulfilled here. And it's also, we're going to draw it as a spiral. Because although the cycle goes around and around, it's not going to repeat like a movie you saw last, like a movie you've seen over and over again. And whether the spiral is spiraling up or spiraling down or whatever involves longer cycles that we can't go into either. We're just concerned about what we know about, which is really this period. Teshwar did more than just straighten out the time periods. He straightened out the actual dates. Now, he said that they reached the bottom of the cycle in 500 AD. Actually, he said 499, which sounds really precise, but the number comes from an astronomer named Aryabhata who lived in that time period. And Aryabhata said that on his birthday, or whatever it was, that the Earth had gone through 3,600 years of Kali Yuga, and that put the beginning of Kali Yuga at 3100 BC. And he chose a particular date, February 18th, I forgot. In 3102 by our calendar counting. I don't know where he got that date. Nobody knows where he got that date. But Teshwar accepted that date, his date, but said at that date we began Dwapara, we didn't begin Kali Yuga. So straighten that out. But the strange thing, we'll come back to it, is that date. It's a huge clue. Anyway, here we are, 500 AD at the bottom of the cycle, and according to this counting then, the Dwapara Yuga started in 1700. Now, I've drawn on most of these charts some little sections in here which are the transition periods. We have gone through the transition period into Dwapara Yuga. We are fully into Dwapara Yuga energy at this point in time. So whether the change happened at 1700 or a little later, or maybe it was 2012 for all we know, the change has happened. We are in Dwapara Yuga according to these traditions. This is our present time. That's why we've got to think about what that really means, because we are in a different age than we were hundreds of years ago. Well, usually when we talk about an advanced culture or advanced age, we're thinking of technological advancement, because that's the measure that we apply to our own success. Teshwar says that isn't really the right quantity to use. He used dharma. He called it the mental virtue. Dharma has had lots of meanings in translation. Eternal law, or just right thinking and right action. And you ask what's right. Or spiritual duty, even religion I've seen it translated as. I think my favorite definition of dharma is, in this context, is the capacity to think and act in complete harmony with God's will. And in the darkest ages, people simply couldn't do that. In the highest ages, they're in complete harmony with everything. So this is the quantity that varies from the lowest to the highest when we talk about changes in consciousness. So we've got to, and I had to struggle with this when I first learned about these things, is we don't equate that with technological advancement. So, what we're going to do is go through each of the ages and look at their characteristics as given to us by the traditions of both the West and the East. And the American Indians have this tradition. The Sub-Saharan Africans have this tradition. All in different forms, but they very much agree on the characteristics of people during these different times. So starting with the Kali Yuga, we call it the material age because everything we consider real is just what we observe with our senses. The form of thing is its nature, and that's our reality. It's very limiting. It's very contracted. It's very rigid. You depend on things being the way they've always been. You do things in the way your ancestors did them, your parents did them. Everything is very, very fixed and resists change. So Swami Kriyananda suggested certain symbols to represent these ages, and he suggested a solid cubical block. And I put some rivets in mine, so for sure you couldn't expand it. Okay. And we talk about thinking in the box, right? That's the kind of Kali Yuga thinking. Very dependent upon external authorities for your knowledge. You want to know something in the Kali Yuga, you go to the Bible or the authority that can read the Bible or something like that to know something. You don't depend on your own explorations. So what moves us to do things is just we do what we have to do in the Kali Yuga. This is a time when people needed to live by rules. And the fear of punishment for violating rules, whatever that was, whether it was rules about behavior, go to heaven or go to hell, or government will come down on you, whatever it is, your behavior is defined by other people's ideas of what should be done. And in each age, what you want to do, what the virtuous thing to do in each age, is to develop the qualities of the next higher age. So, if somebody in this age begins to want to become a businessman or expand in some way their knowledge, that's a good thing. And so the tendency to contract, to pull away from that pressure to advance is great. There's this temptation always to, go back to the good old days. Keep things the way they've always been. They worked before, they'll work again. This kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that we associate with the Kali Yuga. Well, we say that Dharma then is at a minimum, because with a reduced awareness and a strong ego that's just associated your identity with what you can see and hear and your body, and there isn't an ability to tune into any larger vision or any harmonious energy that you want to tune with. So Dharma is at a minimum in this age. Fortunately, it comes to an end, and it's replaced by the Dwapara Yuga, which we think of as the age of energy. Now, Yukeshwar didn't use the word energy. He used the words electricity, fine matters and electricities. We understand the reality of things is just that these days. The form of things is very variable. The form of things is not its reality. Its reality is the atoms and the molecules that make it up, the subatomic structures, whatever. Because this is what we understand things to be really made of. Not just what we observe. Each age faces problems and has solutions for them. Now, in the Kali age, the problem is the form of things. It's the massiveness of things. And it just takes brute force to shove things around. In this age, the Dwapara age, that isn't the way we do things. We apply energy to the matter and we make machines. We do things with machines. So this is a new solution. The solution comes because of our deepening understanding of reality. Well, this leads to something else. You can think of the world as being form, space, and form requires space, and change requires time, and all of that must have some vibratory source. And this is kind of like the sequence of creation, and so we're working our way back. We understand form now. Form is not a limitation to us. Think of it. You can think of plastics for one thing, and anything else, huge buildings, anything you can imagine. You can compute the shapes and the structures, and really form is not a limitation. But space is, and we're working on that. We got our cell phones, we've got our telescopes, we can go to the moon. So space is less and less of a limitation as time goes on, as we enter into this age. And we're doing that because of the technology, which this goes back again to our deepening understanding of the reality. So as a symbol, we're going to use an expanding surface, okay? Like a billowing cloud, like a billowing bubble. Because this is where most people in this age look for their fulfillment, outside. You put energy into outside things, into appearances, into structures. We don't look inwardly. Well, you folks do. We're learning to do this with yoga, but that's part of always aspiring to the next higher yuga, the next higher state of consciousness, which is true in the descending ages as well as the ascending ages. It's just always there. And we'll speak more about that. But the usual thing here today is looking outside for your fulfillment. So, lots of energy, but it's outgoing. What we use, though, the technology and this outgoing energy to gain experience. So we want to know something, we find it out ourselves. A lot of us are even reluctant to ask directions. We'll look on the internet, but mostly we want experience. We want to make our big decisions on the basis of our own experience, our own knowledge that we really own, not somebody else's opinion, somebody else's advice. So what motivates us then is to gather more knowledge, gather more power, gather more stuff. As though if we have more, that we're somehow bigger. It's this expansion idea again, you see. We're expanding, we include more things in what we are, our knowledge, our power, our wealth, then we feel bigger. That's that expanding on the surface again. See how these characteristics fit together? They come as a package because they're all related to a level of consciousness. Again, we have a temptation. Each age has its temptation. And each age deals with a more subtle form of energy. You think of the Kali Yuga, you can throw rocks at each other. It's not too bad damaging. You can do a little subtly with those rocks and it becomes a bomb. That's more powerful because you understand the chemical energy. And then if you want to make things even more subtle and understand atomic energy, you get huge bombs. So with that understanding that comes in each age comes the ability to handle more and more powerful forms of energy. And so we need to mature in our consciousness, and the technology is forcing us to do that. Technology puts us in situations, what do we think about cloning? What do we think about GMOs? What do we think about this or that? The technology forces us to think about issues that we would never have been able to consider in an earlier age, because it simply wasn't there. This is part of the maturing awareness, maturing consciousness that each age, remember I said the conditions of the age are appropriate for the lessons we need to learn as souls. We come in People that are incarnated now are the people who need the lessons that are available to us here and now, in this culture, in this age. All right, it goes on. The Treta Yuga is the mental age, where mind is important. Now, Yukteswar talked about the reality that would be understood then as a subtle kind of divine magnetism, and he declined to describe it, and I declined to even speculate about it, but be an understanding of what's behind the energy itself. And thought becomes a reality. Thought becomes really something, substance, something with effect in the world. Usually we think of our thoughts as just sort of private little musings until we're around psychic people. I remember one time going to a lecture by some well-known psychic, and I was sitting in first or second row, and at some point during the lecture I had a rather inappropriate thought, and oh, did she glare at me. So think of it, in the Treta Yuga, people control energy with their thought, and this leads to powers of telepathy and clairvoyance. So think of an environment where people have all these abilities. You would be as careful with your thoughts as you are with your clothes today, because they'd be pretty much exposed to everybody else, and that those thoughts would be powerful. So you'd learn to control your thoughts, and you'd use your thoughts in effective ways and in a responsible way. I don't think that people today, if they had that ability, they would misuse that power for the most part. People, in fact, I think psychic people who start to use their powers maybe on the stock market or something for their own personal gain eventually lose their abilities. So this would be a time when people would be very much in empathy with others. If you're aware of other people's pain or other people's needs, you treat them as your own, and you want to serve them. This gives us a whole new way of dealing with space. Now, one aspect of space is what separates. Space is what separates. Separates people one from another. Separates people of different nationalities and religions and so on. The communication that we have today in the Para Yuga is beginning to bring those things together, but being united on a thought level would be even more so. So knowing something is happening in a future, in a different place, this is a well-known kind of clairvoyance, would be common. Knowing something in time. See, the next issue is time. Form, space, now time. And these mental abilities begin to develop an awareness of time and ways of overcoming the limitations it imposes on us. Now we'll see later when we look at the history, this is the kind of yoga when astrology was developed. The ability to know a little bit of the future, the ability to really know the past. You wouldn't need to have a jury vote on something. Truth, it always seems to be pretty absurd. But you wouldn't need that in the Treta Yuga. Wouldn't need a lot of laws. It would be a very, very different, very, very different world. But it's one that we can aspire to. So as a symbol, Swami Kriyananda suggested a pyramid, because a pyramid can be thought of as concentrating energy at its peak. And with that concentrated energy, then we can begin to have a serious effect on the world with our thoughts. Obviously, to know something, you would simply put your consciousness into it and you have a developed intuition. Intuition means you have to have less ego, you have to have a much balanced way of looking at things, your mind is calm, you're under control of your mind, you develop intuition. So this is a time when people have a lot of intuition and know things that way. service of others, living by ideals, living by being aware that Dharma is a value, striving to be more dharmic in every way. You could be. The capacity to be dharmic. Think of a ruler. This is a time when rulers can really shine. Because with their intuition, and with the power of mind, with their empathy with the people around them, both ways, you can have really benign leaders. Leaders that could be very dharmic. Leaders in the Kali Yuga could be dharmic if they wanted to, practically. The conditions just don't make it possible. But here, the ruler could really shine. But there's always the temptation to misuse power. It's with us all the way through. Well, what use is this knowledge? Think of it this way. The Kali Yuga, if we study that, we can understand where we've been. And if we understand what the Treta Yuga is, where we're going, then we can understand how we're going to get there. This may be the most important slide I put up here, because it's the key to what use this knowledge is to us here and now today. We're in the Dwapara Yuga. We've passed through the transition time where outer circumstances sort of change all the rules. And now there's going to be a progression of consciousness pretty steadily, hopefully steadily, but anyway, somehow through this age. And if you can see that you have an enterprise or a proposal for something, and if its energy is consistent with this flow from the characteristics of Kali to the characteristics of Treta, it's probably going to be successful. I can show you instances in history where on the ascending here, we want something that is expansive, that leads to more, that's as dharmic as we can be, that's flexible, fluid. These kind of characteristics are the flow of energy in this age. And something that's consistent with that will be long-lasting and influential. Something going the other way, something contractive, a little bit shady, is not going to be long-lasting. It's going to be, to use a historical example that we're all pretty familiar with. In Athens, there was experiments with democracy. They were at the beginning of the descending Kali Yuga. And democracy didn't take hold there. It was quenched very quickly. The same thing happened at the beginning here between Kali and Dwapara Yuga. But it grew. Democracy became the standard. So something is in tune with it, survives, something it isn't, collapses. And that you can apply that test to anything happening around you and the things you're planning to do. Make sure you're in that flow of expansion, of greater energy, greater dharma, more fluid changes, so forth. So studying these things gives us an idea of how to regard the things that are happening around us. And when we see things changing, we see that things don't work anymore, we can see that those are parts of the Kali Yuga that's past, and of course they don't work in the Dwapara Yuga. You could expect these systems. We need a new financial system. It may collapse. The old one, we have to invent something new. The same thing could be said perhaps of political systems. Things have to become different than they were. So there has to be a collapse of old things, some way of getting rid of the older ways, the older patterns of doing things. So that's why this is a rather tumultuous period. Okay. On to the Satya Yuga. We don't know much about the Satya Yuga. It's so far beyond us. The age of truth. Satya means truth. There it said that we can come to realize that everything is just a projection of divine consciousness. That it's all an illusion. Form, space, and time. We have control over all of those things. Once you understand what the illusion is, then you have control over it. Just like we have a lot of control over form now that we this age would be quite powerful in that respect. But this was the age of paradise. This was the age when they didn't need cell phones. They didn't need books. They didn't need writing. They didn't need farms. They didn't need doctors. We look at the ancient people and we say, oh, these were primitive hunter-gatherers. They didn't have all this good stuff we have today. I think they didn't need it. We're better off without it. We actually enjoy going camping sometime and doing without a lot of these different things if we can. So instead of seeing this as a difficult time, it's a wonderful time. It's a paradise time. And people who, many more people, or how should I say, more people than in other ages will reach liberation in this point. That is to say, souls will have learned all the lessons there are to learn on the physical plane and have no longer any need to incarnate. Yeah.
I'm curious how time is illusory. Then, if you're in that age, then how does it end?
That's interesting. Interesting thought. How does an age end if time is seen as an illusion? Well, maybe it doesn't if you go beyond it. And if you don't go beyond it, you haven't quite learned that lesson. I don't really know. But we'll talk more about time when we come to the Treta Yuga descending. Anyway, to know something, expand your consciousness to become the thing you're talking about, you want to know about. Yukteswar talks about this power. It's one of the cities that advanced yogis experience, that if you want to know about a galaxy, expand your consciousness to the size of a galaxy. If you want to know about an atom, shrink down and understand the atom from its own perspective and size. Because your consciousness is fluid. It has no tie to the particular form of the body it's locked into. So for a symbol, we're going to use an expansion, but this is an infinite expansion from a center. Not from the surface anymore, but from the center. And, you know, the old expression, the center everywhere, circumference nowhere, implies this idea of expanding indefinitely, but still maintaining a center coming from that. The temptation, well, we motivated in the Kali Yuga to serve the slave master or just the rules, the forms. In the Dwapara Yuga, we serve ourselves. In the Treta Yuga, we serve others around us. And in the Satya Yuga, you can see that who you're really serving was God all along. And there's that progression. So again, the characteristics of these ages have a sense to them, a progression to them. So just to summarize, this ascending half of the cycle, it's a tendency toward unity. So again, if we're trying to analyze something in the Dwapara Yuga, does it divide or does it unify? Tendency towards simplicity. If you've tried living in the woods for an extended time, you realize it was a lot more complicated to live without the source of water and the food and so forth that we take for granted today. It's much simpler to use telepathy than cell phones, and much easier to use cell phones than, what, Pony Express or something in the Kali Yuga. So we actually move towards simplicity. Limitations of form and time and space are gradually lifted, and with that comes a diminishing ego. The ego is identification of the soul with the particular body and circumstances. And as you expand that and become more aware of other people and the energy flows around you, and have less and less limitation of being that closed identification, that means a reduction in ego. Until we begin to seek that unity that we all seek, the unity of all life, which can be the experience of the Treta Yuga, Satya Yuga. Reason and feeling come into balance in order to develop intuition. This is sort of one one of the Prapara lessons. We went through a time of excessive dependence on reason, and we know we're moving toward a time of intuition, and so bring that into balance, the feminist movement and so on, trying to balance the masculine and feminine, the reason and feeling. This is part of the changes that we're experiencing in Dwapara Yuga, which are moving us from Kali to Treta. It's that motion, that change that we need to participate in and encourage in each other. With it comes an expanding awareness. Oh, sorry, let me back up. Expanding awareness. Instead of just being aware of your own personal needs, you become gradually more and more aware of everybody else's until you have a kind of planetary consciousness. So, what I'd like to do right now is everybody get about 5 minutes to get up and stretch, because we're going to start down in the second half of this talk, next half hour. So we're going to go down. Right, it's 11 o'clock, right? Yeah, 11 o'clock. We're going to work our way down through the cycle and look at how history fits in with this model. Okay, this isn't and I tell my students, this is not a dogma that says things are a certain way. It's a framework on which you can hang facts and gain understanding. And our normal picture of history, based on linear developments, has filtered those facts and filtered out a lot of stuff that we can look at from a different angle and see that it can fit this model too. So this is a model, a framework, not a thing where everything is fixed like the textbooks that you're used to. So let's just take a couple minutes break. So thanks. Everybody's back now. We can begin our sequence through history as much as we can to see how the yugas played out in history and how we see it through this lens. We'll start with the Satya Yuga, and this was the time of paradise. Now, you read about paradise, you think, oh, and the world could never have been like that, where there was no disease and no food was needed, everything was provided. The animals were friendly. This is such a different picture than the crude hunter-gatherer or caveman kind of picture that, we get one picture in school and another picture in mythology or in religion, and how do we reconcile the two? But really, there's nothing in the bones that people dig up that tells you anything about their consciousness. Caveman, well, the yogis go to caves to meditate. That's not so bad. They didn't have farming. Well, maybe they didn't need it. Oh, where did I say here? Okay, there we are. What we want to look for is evidence of the previous ages that reflect the consciousness of that age. And in the Satya Yuga particularly, anything that's left should be something about consciousness, because that's what they were doing. They were expanding their consciousness and living on a higher level, probably, living only partially on the physical consciousness and quite a bit in the astral. Here's an example, cave art. That's about the only thing that's been preserved from that age that is really tightly connected with consciousness. Interesting thing, the famous caves that you know from Europe, Lascaux, Altamira in Spain, these things were created during the Satya Yuga. The finest cave art came from that age. Now, a more recent cave, Chauvet, that was discovered, I think, in the 90s or so. When they scraped the carbon off the walls and dated that, they were shocked. It was 30-some thousand years old. Put it in the previous Satya Yuga. So there's something about the Satya Yuga that's connected with these caves. Now, they don't let people into them much anymore, but when I've read accounts of scientists that go in, they're overwhelmed by the consciousness effect, by the effect on their consciousness. The animals in the ceiling, the light, everything is just a very moving experience for them. So this cave art is instruments of consciousness. Sacred power spots. They were identified by ancients. There are places where temples have been built one on top of another with a whole series of different religions. Special places where people recognize that they go and it affects their consciousness. I suspect that such places were first identified and perhaps engineered, perhaps created, intensified by landforms during this highest age. Here's one place. This was a real shock to the archaeologists. There's this place called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where there are circles of stones, T-shaped stones, very finely made. And they're dated right up here in the middle of the Satya Yuga. I had an opportunity to go there and see these things firsthand. They, I don't have another picture here, but they're circles of stones, a little like Stonehenge, only they think there's about 20 of them in this hill. And the stones are T-shaped, they're massive, like the largest ones are like 14 feet high. And the curious thing about them is, they don't seem to be very well rooted in the ground. Usually if you're going to build something like that, you bury quite a bit of it below ground, right? But these things aren't. Archaeologists have to support them with timbers now that they've dug them out. Nobody understands what they were for, how they were used, why they were built the way they were. Much more finely carved than Stonehenge. And in fact, to the people that built Stonehenge, this site was older than Stonehenge is to us. Okay? And so were there astronomical alignments? There was no village. They built this before they built villages. This was a shock to the anthropologists who had been telling us, you know, we've all heard the story how people gathered together and then they built they built a social structure and then they had gathering places and so forth. Temples began to appear. Here's something, probably a temple, built by hunter-gatherers, built by people who didn't have a particular physical place to be, except that they built these things and then they very carefully buried them. By one estimate, it took more energy to bury them as carefully as they did as it took to build them in the first place. What was going on? I have no idea. I can tell you the place felt very still. It felt very calm. You know, it's a little hard to sit and meditate deeply in what's effectively a tourist situation, but on that particular tour we've been visiting some Greek and Roman ruins, and they're busy. They're shopping malls. They're theaters. They're a whole different vibration. This place was still, very calm. That's all I can say. Okay, so the Satya Yuga came to an end. Now, during this time period, there had been ice. The beginning of the peak of the ice, the last ice age, or glaciation, was like about 20,000 years ago. So in here, there was some strange things happen. An interval of time called the Younger Dryas period, where it began to warm up, and then suddenly it got very cold, very suddenly. And for about 1,000 years it was cold, and then it warmed up again to the present warm period that we enjoy today. What happened exactly? It's probably the catastrophe of Noah's flood. It probably is the reason we don't have a lot of records of people in those times. We don't know much about it. So the ice melted, water level rose, and inundated any coastal places that might have been developed at all by the people who lived in this period. Underwater archaeology is extremely difficult, and it's, the evidence is covered by silt and washed away and so forth. So there's very little information on what happened then. But this is when the climate stabilized and people began to domesticate plants and animals. Why did they domesticate plants and animals? And how did they do it? They did it very rapidly. Before, apparently by tradition, it said that the people lived in harmony with the animals. But now, and in fact, in Africa, there's one description of the highest age, where they said in that age they didn't need weapons. If they needed game, they stared at an animal and it would die for them. Think of that, a consciousness connection. I've heard some traditions like that in modern times in the native cultures. So something changed about our relationship with nature that forced us to start domesticating animals and plants. Everybody recognizes this as a great turning point. All of these turning points at the edge of at the junction of the ages are well recognized by historians as important turning points in history. So this is the time where they say, well, agriculture became really important. The first major cities were developed, and as I say, we've lost harmony with nature. So agriculture then was an adaptation to a condition where they needed more food. They had lost their attunement with nature. Nature no longer provided what was needed. The earliest signs of agriculture, they say, well, they didn't, plant everything in rows the way we do today and cultivate the land and so forth. They helped where things were growing that they wanted, like weeding. And the way they describe the earliest sounds very much like the some of the organic gardening, food forest kind of things that are happening today that people talk about, where you have lots of things growing together and you just sort of help everything along and it all becomes productive. There's no way you could tell in archaeology that how much human involvement there was in that. But if they were doing that kind of agriculture in the Satya Yuga, and then had to become more organized and structured in the Treta Yuga because of a loss of harmony with nature. Each of these major changes appear to be adaptations to a reduction in consciousness. We'll see more of that. So, if Treta was the time of when time was under full control in the beginning and became more and more of a restriction as time went on, we would expect to find artifacts of the Treta Yuga having to do something with time. Well, foremost is the Vedic science of consciousness. The ancient Vedas came out of this time period. You can tell by internal references to the geography and the stars. And some people have characterized the Vedas as discussions of consciousness and time. Time was very important to them. Also, out of that time came the science of astrology. There is something called the Book of Brigu. This exists as bundles of papers. It's split up into pieces, and there's bundles of papers throughout northern India. And there's a similar book in southern India. And what you do is you go to the place of one of these people where part of the book is kept, and he creates an astrological chart for you. Then they go into the bundles and try to find a piece of paper in those bundles that has that chart on it. And if it does, you have a reading from the book of Brigu. And Swami Kriyananda did this. He got his reading. It told him his name, which was a very unusual name. It told him where he was born. It told him that he lived in on this continent, under the world, was the way it described it. It told him things about his life that he didn't know at the time and was able to verify later. For example, it said that 2 brothers were possible, but a sister would die in the womb. And later he went home and asked his mother, and yes, she'd had a miscarriage that he didn't know about. Things like this. It told him future things which later did come true. How long he would live, for example, was right on. There are stories about the book of Brigu. There was one story of a man who went, I think he was a Westerner, who went to one of these villages to visit the book. And he went on a train or a bus. I think it must have been a train with a compartment. It was with 5 other people there. And when he got to the Brigu Pundit, those 5 people were there. And his reading said, "Since you came from so far, I had 5 of my devotees accompany you." And he gave their names and where they'd been sitting. Now, Swami Kriyananda took his reading, actually his second reading, to a museum curator and asked him how old this piece of paper was. He says, "Oh, not old at all, maybe 200 years, something like that." So, if it was more than a week, it would be a shock. So how possibly could anybody have, on an astrological basis, created such specific predictions? Can you imagine, these are homework papers of students. Can you imagine an astrology class where your assignment is to produce a chart for somebody some 5,000 years in the future who's going to arrive on a certain date? Incredible. And yet, there it is. It exists. Many people have had experience with that book. And as I say, there's a book in southern India called Vyasa, which is similar. It's written on palm leaves. And people have had readings from that are right on. Very, very old. Now, it's attributed to Brigu. Brigu was one of the sages of the Treta Yuga that wrote or composed part of the Vedas. So it's definitely tied in with that time period. Now, whether it was actually produced that for long ago, I don't know. But it was produced according to the technology that they had in those days. The technology of astrology that we have today has been handed down to us through books. Every astrologer starts with the books. They develop their own intuition, but they wouldn't know how to start from scratch. There are some cycles in Vedic astrology that, depending on numbers, that if we lost those numbers, there'd be no way of recovering them because nobody knows where they came from. And yet they work precisely. So, hints of a technology having to do with consciousness and time. Archaeologists go looking for pots and things. I think they're just poking around in the wrong places. What else do we have? The linguists tell us that it was right around this time that languages diverged, and we began to have many languages, and we didn't, whereas before there were fewer. Well, we have the story of the book of Brigu, for example. I'm sorry, the story of the Tower of Babel. And in that story, people were able to understand each other. They gathered together on this project, but after a time, they lost the ability to understand each other, and they went to war with each other. And I think that's an allegory of the close of the Treta Yuga. When the mental powers shrunk, the telepathic component of everyday communication diminished, and so people began to speak different languages. They were depending on the words, and there wasn't that telepathic connection. And when people don't communicate on that level, they misunderstand each other. With a misunderstanding comes war. So wars are non-existent in the Satya Yuga. They begin to develop toward the end of the Treta Yuga. Organized war as we know it. And in the Dwapara Yuga, it was the everyday norm. So this is consistent with the idea that as the Yuga ended, it lost these mental powers of intuition and of empathy for others. All these characteristics that we think of associated with the Treta Yuga began to diminish. And the history seems to bring that out. The Tower of Babel is in fact attributed to this time period, the story. Now here's some of the civilizations that you may read about that were Treta Yuga civilizations. In India, it's called Mehrgarth, very extensive and much older than the Indus Valley civilization that you've read about. Jarmo, Jericho, Çatalhöyük is another city, the first town that they know of in Turkey, and I visited that too on the trip that we took there. But it's just a residential area, and it doesn't have a lot, doesn't really tell you an awful lot about the people. People were living pretty simply and very compactly in those days. Here's a list: Indus Valley, Egypt. All of these things, places date from that time period in the Treta Yuga. But that came to an end, and we entered into the Dwapara Yuga. Now here's this date, 3100 again. I assert that as the astrology, that astrology gives us a clue to what was going on here. Because I feel that whoever invented astrology in the first place must have been able to feel directly the influences of the stars. Oh, feels like Jupiter's catching up with Mars. Just the same way we know whether it's a sunny day or a rainy day. They would know what the influence of the stars were, and they could correlate it with their human affairs, and then write the rules down in the books for people to use who didn't have that capacity. There's a lot in the descending ages where technologies were packaged for people who couldn't have invented them themselves. And so we find, jumping ahead, we find batteries in the lower part of the Dwapara Yuga, used by people who couldn't have understood the electricity, but somebody did in order to invent the battery in the first place. So this characteristic of, there was even a kind of a movement, I think back in the 70s or 60s, called appropriate technology, where we thought we could teach people in underdeveloped countries how to use materials they had around them in better ways than they did, by appropriately applying a little bit of the technology, solar ovens and so forth. Not that they could build it themselves or invent it themselves. We were superior in that way. It was kind of I didn't think it was a very good attitude, but it is a characteristic of things in the Dwapara Yuga, descending ages, where things are sort of packaged for others to use. We may not understand what may not have had the capacity to invent in the first place. And so they had to keep track of the stars. And so we see in places like Stonehenge, which in fact the first level of Stonehenge was developed around 3100 BC, a lot of the archaeology here has things aligned with stars, like they were observing the stars. They were very conscious of keeping track of the stars, which is something, if you're practicing astrology, you need that information. But if you had direct awareness of these things, you wouldn't need that information. We lost the mental powers, and this is the time period when writing became important. People started keeping track of times. So, and events locked in with time making records. So this was the beginning of record keeping. So historians say this was the beginning of history, because to them, history is things that are written down. This was the first Egyptian dynasty, 3100. Sumerian dynasties, Chinese records have begun. The Mayan calendar, we've all heard about the Mayan long count, started in 3114, same time period. I was going to say something about that time. Maybe this is the time to do it. That specific date that was identified by the astronomer Aryabhata, turns out he had to assume the stars were all aligned in a line at that point in time. And then it is calculations from there. Astronomers went back and they compute the planets at that time, and there was nothing special, nothing very special about the alignment of the planets at that time. Until Richard Thompson, a devotee of the Bhaktivedanta line, did calculations over a 6,000-year period of how clustered together in the sky the planets were. Because they never really line up in a row, but they are sometimes more together and sometimes they're spread out. And he developed a kind of number to characterize that, and he computed that over that time period. When he included all the planets, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, asteroids, Sirius, Vesta, and so on, he found that was a unique date. There was only one other period when the planets were as tightly clustered, when you included all the planets, as they were on that one day. It was traditionally the beginning of the age. Not only that, the center line of that clustering of stars lines up with the position of the vernal equinox on Aryabhata's time, which is what he had to assume. How did he know that that date was so unique? How did he know that that was the date in which he could assume all the planets were lined up? Planets that were supposedly not known until modern times. Well, how could an astrology be developed that was so specific? Unless they were including the influence of all these other outer planets. I think those two facts put together. That maybe in the Treta Yuga, they knew all about the solar system. Remember, in the Satya Yuga, you would expand your consciousness to the size of the solar system and understand, you'd be aware of all these other planets that we have to space probes and telescopes to see today. So you see, these facts of history seem to only fit together, or they fit together a lot better in this model than they do in the linear development model, because that leaves you with a lot of unexplained things. Whereas these things, you can see that they can fit together. Oh, one other thing about the Mayan calendar. This long cycle between 3114 and 2012 is exactly 1/5 of the astronomical precession cycle that Yukteswar identified with the Yuga cycle. And in the 24,000-year cycle of Yukteswar, the period between the beginning of Dwapara descending and the beginning of Dwapara ascending is 1/5 of the total cycle. So it seems to me that the Mayans knew about this cycle. They just did their calculations with the astronomical number, which supposedly they couldn't have known about. And Yukteswar uses the simpler 24,000-year symbol. So it all kind of fits together. Stonehenge, much cruder than Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe had several circles. Now, we've talked about the ages descending and the ages ascending. And the descending ages were constantly losing something, and in the ascending ages we're gaining them back. So there's a symmetry there. And when we look at the Dwapara Yuga descending and compare it to Dwapara Yuga ascending, we can't expect to see the same things. But we'll see corresponding things. For example, the tradition in Dwapara Yuga descending would be to do things mentally. So if you were going to control energy, the highest way to do it is mentally. That's magic. In Dwapara Yuga ascending, we're used to doing things materially. So the way of controlling energy is with matter, with machines. So, do I have the slide on that again? Yes. The combination of energy and mind is magic. The combination of energy and matter is machines. So the pharaoh's duty in Dwapara Yuga descending was to keep the most powerful spells out of the wrong hands. Just as our own leader's duty is to keep the most powerful weapons out of the enemy's hands. Same problem, but with the differences in the yugas. So that's the way to think about it when you try to say, well, where were their freeways? Well, no, they were using the mind, and maybe a few of them had some mental ways of getting around. We tend to use our mind to invent things. But you can see differences. For example, if you study the culture in ancient Egypt is a great example, because Egypt, the first dynasties were 3100, and by 700 BC, they had lost their sovereignty to other countries. The Greeks, the Romans, the Libyans, everybody had taken them over at one time or another. And in fact, they regained their sovereignty in the 1950s. How's that for symmetry? And you can see, if you look at their records, how punishments, for example, for the same crime were much more lenient in the upper part of the cycle than they were later in the Yugas. And we can see in our own time, we think of the Sharia law and the Muslims with very extreme punishments. And that belongs to the Kali Yuga. And we're moving away from that to less extreme punishments. We really hesitate to execute anybody these days. In the old days, you strung people up very readily. So things are changing in our time in just the opposite direction to what you see them changing in the historical time. Okay, we're into descending Dwapara Yuga. As I said, dynastic Egypt just fits. And we would expect to find then artifacts having to do with energy. Well, how about the pyramids? How about the stone circles? It seems as though where there are these stoneworks, these megalithic stoneworks, that they've done something to the currents of the energy, controlling the earth currents of energy. There's one story, I have time to do it, I think, about the pyramids in Mexico, Tikal. One researcher was an electronics engineer, and his job was processing seed with electric fields in order to make them germinate more readily. It actually improved the life of the seed to treat it with electromagnetic fields, electrostatic fields. I don't know exactly what the treatment was. But he had all the equipment for measuring these kinds of phenomena. So he took his equipment to various places. There were supposed to be power spots. And one of the things he'd put seed there, and then overnight, he'd be with it, he'd watch his instruments, and then he'd germinate those seeds and see if they were affected in any way by the earth currents that happen like 3 o'clock in the morning or in the hours before dawn. Well, he took his instruments to the biggest pyramid in Tikal, big fancy pyramid, the latest one. The natives take their seeds up there to be treated overnight, be blessed before they plant them. It's a tradition. So he took his instruments up there and sat all night looking at a meter that didn't budge. There was no energy there. So he took his equipment over to the oldest pyramid, one that's kind of decrepit. It's off a little ways. People don't pay that much attention to it. And he found that was the most powerful spot he'd ever measured. The seeds that he left there overnight were much more vigorous than the controls. But that was the oldest. And so he began to realize that maybe the Mayans became prosperous because they were processing seeds for other people. Because they built the pyramids first, and then they became prosperous. Usually you think of a culture you would expect a culture to become prosperous, and then they'd have the money and the resources to do something like a big pyramid. But no, they did it first. Maybe it was because they understood the energies and utilized those. Maybe that's where their prosperity came from. In any case, it's a technology lost during the descending age, which has now been recovered. We process the seeds electrically in the laboratory, but we're doing the same thing that they were doing by taking them up to the tops of pyramids. So, again, just doing things in a different way. Magic, energy, and mind. This is the time when these things that are coming into vogue now were invented that involve a connection between energy and mind. Yoga, Ayurveda, Vastu, Feng Shui. Feng Shui, the energies flowing in the room. All of these things were becoming aware of them. They were kind of hidden and not much used in the darkest ages of the Kali Yuga. But as we're coming back into Tripara Yuga now, we're beginning to recover these things and people giving them more credence and beginning to use them. The combination of energy and mind. We recover. These things were invented then in the Tripara Yuga. Again, we don't know how to reinvent them, do we? You can't. Vastu, Feng Shui, we can't figure out where all these rules came from. We just maybe know they work. We have to recover that technology in our own way, in our own slow way, that we will at some point during our Tripara Yuga. This was the time of empires, wars, of commerce. Remember I said this was the time, the characteristic of Tripara Yuga was to increase your power, increase yourself by increasing yourself in some outward way, like power and money and so forth. And so this is the time when the merchant has a really opportunity to make a lot of money, to accumulate a lot of power, whatever. This is the time for it. That age is appropriate, and that's what they did. There were lots of empires, lots of wars, and we're seeing that today. And I can say that this tells us that war is not going to disappear in our own time. It will get different, it will get more refined as we get to be higher in the Tripara Yuga, but we can see that it's a Tripara Yuga characteristic. Not until Treta Yuga will wars begin to diminish. So that's not too encouraging, but at least we're on the upswing. Here's some of the Tripara cultures that you probably know about. The Egyptians I talked about, Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, Babylonians, the Indus Valley and the Ganges Valley civilizations, in China, the Shang Dynasty, and the Olmecs, and later the Mayans in South America. So there was a lot, they're always discovering that there's a lot more commerce and transportation than they ever dreamed. They're finding now lots of ancient connections between the Americas and the Asian continents. Can't go into those details. Now, the Vedas are becoming important to us, and we have here Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is the basis of yoga. These things go back to the Vedas, composed in the Treta Yuga, codified as we got into Tripara, as the four Vedas: the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda. As time went on, people couldn't understand these Vedas. They lost the ability to understand them. They had to read interpretations, and elaborations, and commentaries. And so that's the reality of these other scriptures, the Brahmanas, the Upanishads, and so forth. They explain the Vedic teachings to the people of this time. And people began to write them down, of course. And we have Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which codified the yoga that we know. The Bhagavad Gita describes, is part of the Mahabharata, which describes a great war that happened at the end of Dwapara Yuga. Every age change is catastrophic. And the Mahabharata war was the giant war at the end of Dwapara Yuga, entering into Kali. When you read the books, it'll tell you that that happened at 3100 BC because of this mistake, which I don't have time to go into detail on today. But historically, it seems to have happened right around 1400 BC or 1200 BC, something like that. And the Bhagavad Gita is part of the Mahabharata that describes that situation then, and it changed from Dwapara to Kali. And now we can understand the Gita is meaningful to us. The masters have brought back a deeper meaning that we can understand of the Gita. This is very meaningful to us. I predict that in time we'll begin to understand the Upanishads and the Brahmanas, and soon, eventually, the Vedas themselves will become accessible to us in the higher ages, because these are expressions of the eternal truths that are appropriate to the ages in which they were created. So this is where we have the roots of yoga. As we've gotten into the Dwapara Yuga ascending, these are now accessible to us. Okay, that came to an end. Everything, the scriptures had to be written down. It really lost the ability to carry on things strictly by oral tradition. A lot of technologies were lost, I described that, and a lot of cultures degenerated. In fact, historians talk about this period, 1200 BC, as the collapse of the Bronze Age. Curiously, historians think of this as the Bronze Age. That all goes back to a museum curator in Copenhagen that just arranged his stuff according to the metals or materials that the artifacts were made of that he had, and then he found they were sort of chronological. So they weren't really thinking of the Greek ages when they named this the Bronze Age, but that's what people generally think of as the Bronze Age. Anyway, there was so much destruction of cultures at that time, especially throughout the Middle East. Hundreds of sites show that the cities were destroyed in some way. And there's lots of argument on what was it, war, earthquakes, some other catastrophe. Whatever it was, it shifted, it allowed the power to shift to different parts of the world, and we began to see, in the beginning of the Kali Yuga, the rise of classical Greece. This age is called the pivotal age, the axial age. The age when things turned, and this is when the teachers came: Krishna, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Zoroaster, the philosophers, Thales, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato. They all are right here in the early part of the Kali Yuga. Isn't it interesting that at the change between Dwapara and Kali came a whole new set of teachers with new vision, new ways of expressing the eternal truths appropriate to the people of that time, not so appropriate to the people before, to carry them through the Kali Yuga. Now here we're going out now into Dwapara Yuga, and we have another influx of teachers, of masters that have come with these eternal truths packaged for this time and these people. The Chinese call that the time of the 100 philosophers. Your books will tell you that people made a lot of material progress in this age, That is to say, they learned to use matter better. This was their whole way of doing things, with matter rather than magic. But they considered machines toys. This, I think, is very telling. My favorite is an engineer called Hero. He lived in Alexandria. He was a Roman, I think, or Greek, and he left us with diagrams, at least, of things that he'd invented that had to do a lot with pneumatics and mechanical things that we'd recognize in the present day, but were pretty novel in his day. He had a cylinder and a pump that he used for fire engines, and he had a steam device that whirled around with jets, and I think he had everything he needed to have built a steam engine. He could have started the Industrial Revolution. My favorite invention of his, it captures kind of the spirit of it, was a coin-operated holy water dispenser. The Roman churches, okay? He took a big vessel, think of a big vase with a narrow neck, and in the neck you have a plug with a slot for the coin to go in, and underneath that's a bucket. The bucket's on a lever attached to the valve, so when the bucket gets heavy enough, has enough coins in it, it lifts the valve, and of course the water comes out, and the person gets a sample of water, but the bucket is tipped over and the coins spill out, and so then it resets. Perfectly workable mechanism, but it did not start a whole craze of vending machines in ancient Rome. It just wasn't the time. So the machines were considered toys. They used some machines. They had to. They're not opposed to it, but it wasn't. They weren't seen for their potential. Today, if we see a new invention, we think of the potential it has for doing other things and expanding. It's expansion. But there, they didn't have that sense of expansion. So the machines were just toys. Truth was known by authority. Lots of material, tons of material artifacts. No shortage of material artifacts from that day. Well, what about this junction between the two Kali Yugas? You think, well, maybe that doesn't, how would you tell one from the next? Well, there was a huge shift there. Huge. Nomads came out of the steppes of Asia and invaded China, India. There was a climate disruption. There seems to be a climate shift with every change of Yuga. Think of that. We're in the middle of a climate shift right now. That triggered a plague, killed a lot of people in Europe, shifted the power. The Roman Empire collapsed, the Western Roman Empire. So there was a huge shift right at that point, which put power into things. European nations today trace their beginnings only back to that point, because there was so much migration and shifting of peoples that, whoever lived in that particular area was somebody else at that time. Shifting and moving, changes, fluid changes, disruptions of a major sort, centered on 500 AD, and the tree rings data from that date showed very clearly that there was a huge global disruption in climate, which of course causes famines and probably triggered the plague, where the rats had to go somewhere else that they didn't normally go. All right, this takes us up to 1700. Sort of between the rise of Islam, 600, to the European Renaissance, 1400 to 1700, something like that. That period of time we think of as the European Dark Ages. Power was more in the hands of the Middle Eastern cultures at that time. But all during that time, things hadn't changed. Truth was defined by authorities in the past. Traditions were important. You knew your position in society according to your heredity, and you accepted that. You couldn't much improve yourself. We all know the history of those ages. I don't have to go into detail. But we know that today we're seeing the breakdown of old forms, We talk about alternative energy in every way, and we're learning more and more to overcome the limitations that matter has. So we started this story all over again. We're fitting in perfectly with the predictions of the cultures, many cultures give to this age. I talked about commerce, and how these changes provide for us the opportunity to learn things. People today, more people today, can become very wealthy than ever before. But what happens to a very wealthy person? Do they begin to just use their money to influence others, become powerful, like some of the very powerful banking dynasties, this kind of thing? Or do they become philanthropists? Do they use their money to support other people, to support public works? That's quite a test. But that's what we have to learn in Dwapara Yuga to get between. It was a good thing in Kali Yuga to begin to learn to acquire things for yourself. But it moved into a time where that's characteristic of everybody else is in that same boat. Now we have to learn to share it with others. So moving in that direction is something that we can learn in this time because we have the opportunity to have lots of energy, lots of power, lots of money. That's the opportunities that the technology especially is bringing us. We're learning to see space as an illusion. It's all fitting in very well. So here, as we come to the end of it, we understand Dwapara if we understand where we came from and where we're going. Then we can understand the changes we need to support and experience and see what's going on around us, moving in that direction. At the same time, we can compare our current Dwapara with ancient times, and we see, again, some clues about where we're going. Because where they came from, we're going to be too, in some different way, in some different form. So just to sum things up, we're thinking of the earth as a classroom. Classrooms have different lessons in different places at different times for different people. And they leave behind different kinds of stuff. So we can't just expect to learn everything we need to know from bones and pots. But like any school, when the bell rings, people are coming and going, some people are going out, other people are coming in, things getting torn off the wall, new instructors come, it's a whole new scene. That chaos is what we're in the middle of, and we'll see more of before things settle down, if they ever do, because this is not an age, this is not a safe age, this is an age of constant change. So, but it's a positive message. We look forward to making progress over what's gone before. You know, the thing, when we see things collapsing around us, we can say, oh, this is the change, this is what's needed to get rid of the old and to bring in the new. When you go to India, where they still believe we're in the Kali Yuga and will be for a long time, I've noticed that people will excuse some bad things that are happening around and saying, oh, well, what do you expect? It's Kali Yuga. It'll only get worse. That's not a very positive attitude. But I think in the West, we have the attitude of moving forward, and that's very ingrained in us of making progress, moving forward, making it a positive way. So the things that are happening around us that seem negative are just the chaos of the bell rings. Yeah. And I want to leave that message with you, that hopeful view, because I think that's the most important thing to get out of the understanding of the Yugas, is that life is getting better, and we have a role in it. We have a role in it. There's one place in Yukteswar's book where he's using the Yugas as states of consciousness of the developing yogi, where he says, when people generally have the consciousness of Dwapara, then the world is in Dwapara Yuga. So our business in practicing yoga is to raise our consciousness. So we're aiding this process just by being who we are. So thank you very much.